let me stop here and say that I'm much more interested in having your remarks and questions than listening to myself ramble on. So I look very much forward to the Q&A and the remarks of yours. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Yeah, just give us your name.
Earl Wertheim. I'm with the UPS store. What was the name of the company that you said employed 20,000 people in the U.S.?
Maersk, M-A-E-R-S-K.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Or? Yeah.
Richard Cate with the University of Vermont. I was curious if you could describe the relationship between your higher ed system and the private sector in terms of working together, technology improvements, business enterprise, that sort of thing. Is there a connection between the higher ed?
Can you expand on that connection between the higher end of society and
higher education?
Between higher education, I'm sorry, I abbreviated. Between higher education and the private sector.
You would probably be surprised by my answer, having said what I just said. One of the ways in which the US society seems to distinguish itself very clearly from the Danish society is that you have a sort of clear movement, as I see it in Washington, D.C., between people working in government, in administration, sometimes starting their career in Congress, and in the business sector. We would typically have people like myself coming out of university as an economist and then joining foreign service 31 years ago and still working in government. I've often thought about going into private business after having been ambassador to the US, been working so much with European affairs, now going to China, and then I should think of going into the private sector. But I've never done it. That's very typical of us. So we would actually have what we think are experts in public governance, public administration, like myself, and then another part of the population working in the private sector, trying to specialize and doing what they're good at. The model, however, works surprisingly well for us because we have very good and efficient cooperation between the two sectors. We know that the public sector cannot secure Danish welfare in the long run. We have to have a very sort of attentive, mindful, effective cooperation with the private businesses. But there are no strings attached. We're very sort of, I'm paid by the government to give you this rosy picture of Denmark. We're very completely uncorrupt. There's no sort of lobbying or networks go on that you could sometimes worry that is a little bit at the heart of some of the...
Let me interrupt you and pick up on the question. In this country, I think people will agree with me. What business people will tell you is they're in desperate need of workers, and they don't have the workers who can fill those jobs. On the other hand, too often we're producing workers for jobs that were made obsolete 20 years ago. I think maybe that's part of what your question was about. How are you, your universities and your colleges training workers to fill the important jobs of today and tomorrow?
By being a small country, you know that the university graduate, the university output, the academic output that you produce has to fit into our society. So those companies in Denmark that have been grown big during the centuries or the last decades, they have a great influence on what university does for a living. So there's a pretty good connection between our higher education and what our business sector asks for. It's always been an issue that the president said the right government in Denmark should be doing that even better. And we always think that you Americans are doing it much better, much smarter, because you have some of the best universities in the world, and you really have. And you try to copy that part of your society and make a lot of research happen between companies and our technical universities. We only have one really big technical university, like similar to MIT, but not all, of course, equal to MIT. And they would have very close cooperation with Danish business altogether in all aspects of producing new research and technology. And most of their engineers would go exactly into private companies, very few in public administration. I think we benefit from being a small society, a little bit like here in Vermont, where we almost all know each other. So there's a pretty good transparency. On top of that, the last many years, development in terms of IT has penetrated our society to the degree that the CEO of Microsoft really likes our country. He says we're all countries like the Danish society in use of Microsoft products. In the world, they would be a really big company because that enhances transparency and an efficient contact and communication. And I said, we don't have networks, but business networks and opportunities thereby are real. We're very mindful of that equation, but I think our politicians, our position in Parliament will still say that we're grappling with it, trying to increase the efficiency between exactly that interface.
Okay, other questions, sir?
Our country obviously has just gone, hi, my name's Al Gouvet. I own a restaurant company, very small company. We sell a lot of fish. Our country has just gone through a process discussing healthcare for all. And the thing I was fascinated about when I was reading about Denmark is the employers' union in Denmark and the voice that business has. Because I feel in America that political parties have a voice and they tend to speak for business, but business doesn't always have a clear voice, because I don't know any business owner that would ever want one of their employees to lose their health insurance or not get health care or have anything ever bad happen to them, at least not at my level. But it gets kind of convoluted in America at who's for what and how in the Danish world is there a balance between the dialogue, the discussions, so that business owners that care about people and obviously care about their hometown or their state can have good things happen, but also be listened to so that business isn't adversely affected.
That's an excellent question. It was one you discussed a little bit last night. You have an you have an employers union, you have a heavily unionized workers segment. A lot of what takes place in that country comes out of that. But Mr. Besson?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. We have what we call a Danish model, in which a lot of sort of labor market legislation would actually not be made by our Congress, our Parliament, but be made by agreements by this highly unionized Danish labor force. More than 60% of Danish labor are unionized, and their opposite employers' organizations. So they enter into labor market agreements that has been the sort of core of our strategic comparative advantages in Denmark, simply because they know what is best for the labor market, for the employers and employees. So they've been doing this, of course, primarily on wages, but especially in the last many decades, also expanded that equation to what kind of other benefits should be there. At the same time, we've had a model in which healthcare was never an issue for a business owner or for business. That's something that the government takes care of. So that's a government healthcare system, and we think quite effective, because the challenge to modern societies like the US and Denmark and everyone else trying to attain our standard of living and maybe try to outcompete us in the future, that is not only to make brilliant labor market agreements or brilliant research or brilliant public sectors. It is to make sure that the interface and the relationship between all the institutions you need to build in a modern society to take care of our life from cradle to grave is constantly adjusted in the division of labor between the public sector and the private sector. We've said government, public sector seems to be the best provider of healthcare in modern societies, where the demand for health services in reality is endless. The only way in which you can provide that is through a very efficient government-run system. And then we've discovered, if you add the US system, totality, the private sector, on top of that, you can do the 9% of the GDP of healthcare, and then if people want to pay more by themselves, they can finance that out of their own pockets. So you have the total freedom of choice, but you have a very high health output. I'm a diplomat, so I'm trying to be round. We have probably a little bit better health output than you have if you measure it objectively. On health, you can do that. It's a matter of life expectancy.